So we had three breakout room inquiries on the table. The first one being, what is the thesis of the text? Second one being, why the emphasis on the distinction of the Black church opposed to the standardized or dominant Christian church is needed. And then three, what new understandings of Black Islam did you gain from the text? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms? Okay. Go ahead, Lorianne. Go ahead. Thank you.
So I'll just say that I chose critical thinking question number 2, discuss the IFA concepts of all human as divinely chosen. And Nyan, for what are they chosen? How does this compare, contrast with other religious concepts of chosenness with which you are familiar? And how does that concept of Nyan strengthen the concept of required respect for persons and peoples? I said I chose critical question option 2, the IFA concepts of all humans as divinely chosen according to Anian is on page 233 in the book. It says, thirdly, Muhammad argues that Black people are of the nature of God, divine beings, the chosen of God, and that the white oppressors of Black people and the peoples of color in the world are diabolical. In fact, the embodiment of evil, i.e. the devil. Thus, fourthly, he argued for separation from both the oppressor and the context of oppression and the creation of a new society. What the book means by this is that the Black people are chosen from God as divine beings, for they are chosen by God for being Black according to Islam. This compares and contrasts with other religious concepts of chosenness with which I am familiar with in Christianity. This is contradicting to Christianity because I was familiar with chosen ones as being part of the 144,000 written in the book of Revelation. And then I just wrote basically what the Bible said about the 144,000. So I'm saying it could be contradicting to some people, but it's just, yeah, that's what I put.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very comprehensive analysis. And I like how you took this idea of chosenness that was talked about more so last week, and you brought it into this week's reading and made them relate, because they are very much related. And for me, when I was reading the text, I've seen a lot of similarities in how these religions kind of frame the value systems into a lot of ancient African concepts. So thank you for that, Lorianne.
Thank you.
Who else would like to share? Let's get 2 more and we'll move on. Kevin, what was discussed in your group?
So one of the things we talked about was why the distinction of Black Christianity is needed. And the reason why I believe the distinction is needed is because there are just so many different variations of Christianity altogether. But not only that, Black Christianity in itself is very unique, especially in its origin of how it was when it was first being presented or being forced upon the people when they're brought over to America. The enslavers, they wanted to use it as a way of dominating them, while they used it as they converted in order to. It was multiple reasons, but the reason I remember was because they mostly used it as a way, as kind of like hope for a way to get out of a way to free themselves, because they didn't believe that their original religion was going to be the way to help them out of there.
Thank you, Kevin. You know what? Next week, I'm going to assign a homework, sorry, not homework assignment, an extra credit assignment. That will be a film. And the film's on Netflix, and it's called Sankofa. And the reason why I want to sign this film, I really should have signed it last week, but it's okay, it'll still work. It's to Kevin's point, right? This idea that the indigenous African spiritual practices that the Africans brought with them in their forced migration to the Americas, this notion that they didn't view those traditions and practices as effective conduits for the liberation, right? This film turns that idea on its head, and it says that it argues that many of the revolts and revolutions that took place to thwart off enslavement was done under the guise of these ancient African spiritual institutions, right? And I believe in the film Sankofa, the spiritual tradition that's being practiced is called the Akan tradition. And you see within the film how they use a lot of these elements within the Akan tradition to help them liberate themselves. Another example of this is Haiti, right? Haiti is the first successful Black state to effectively engage in the revolution and remove enslavement off of their territory, right? What's important and significant about the Haitian Revolution is they would go down to the swamplands and they would engage in these ceremonies and these rituals and these practices that were steeped in these African traditions. And they would use that mystical power to give them the courage and the strength to engage in this revolutionary battle to liberate themselves. And you would hear accounts from the French, so because Haiti is at war with French, Haiti is a French colony. So you would hear accounts from the French soldiers of Haitians jumping down the barrels of cannons, Haitians getting shot in the chest with guns and rising to their feet and still being able to fight, right? And a lot of this is due to this African spiritual tradition. And one of the core components of these African spiritual traditions is there's no fear of this concept, or even the concept of death, right? They don't view it like that. And if you notice the way that I talk about death, I rarely say the word death, I'll say transition, right? And this is directly in line with a lot of African spiritual traditions that say, we don't believe in this concept of death. We transition to the next phase of our life as ancestors. And this concept allowed these Haitians to engage in battle and not have fear of death. So it allowed them to do things that would seem almost inhuman because they were not limited by that fear of death. Let's get one more comment and we'll move on to my notes. What was discussed in your breakout rooms? Jessica, what was discussed in your group?
So we mainly talked about the second one.
Okay.
So we were talking about how, like, when it came to Black Christianity, the origins of like Black people getting into Christianity started with slavery, and that's how they got into it, because they were trying to put the mindset of like being subservient is in the Bible. And so Black Christianity is trying to gain independence from that by creating a community that serves for them and promote ideas that serves for them. Pierre mentioned that like it helps cater to like Black needs because it's very it's centered for Black people. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things there, right? To paraphrase what Jessica is articulating. One, the distinction is necessary because of how enslavement introduced its Black African people to Christianity. But I do want to put an asterisk to this claim, right? Because I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ethiopian Orthodox Church, right? Ethiopian Coptic Church, right? These are very, very ancient and deeply seated African Christianity that comes out of Ethiopia. I don't have a clear interpretation of what came first, right? The European interpretation of Christianity or the Ethiopian Orthodox version of Christianity. But I don't want you all to come under the understanding that the only way that African peoples interacted with Christianity is through forces of oppression, right? There is an indigenous and authentic African Christianity that comes out of Ethiopia. Okay. So what I'm going to do is move through my notes and then we'll lead that into our fishbowl and we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time in Christianity just because, for the most part, I think that's something that you all are a little bit more familiar with, whether it be just Christianity as a whole, or like this Baptist Black interpretation of Christianity. I think that's a little bit more familiar to you all, juxtaposed to things like Islam and the Moorish Science Temple of America and things of that nature. But what I do found of vast importance from the Christian tradition is this notion of Black liberation theology, right? And it says its earliest aspirations during the Holocaust of enslavement. So this is when it finds its earliest roots, if you will, this Black liberation theology during enslavement. But its definite formation as an intellectual discipline is more closer to our time, right? So there's one thing to think about, and I know it's mentioned in the beginning of the semester when Karenga talks about Black studies having to have a practice accompany the theory, right? And this idea of praxis. But this kind of goes back to how he's thinking about liberation theology and the distinguishing between the theory and the practice, right? So he's saying the practice of Black liberation theology finds its roots during the process of enslavement, right? But the theoretical foundations of liberation theology has a more contemporary feel to it, okay? So I think what you could glean from that also is Black scholars who are concerned with liberation from a Christian paradigm are looking back in time during enslavement and saying, yo, what these individuals were doing, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, they were doing Black liberation theology work, right? So they're gonna assign the intellectual signifier to the work that was being done in the past, okay? They say that Black liberation theology is a response to the teachings and the theologies of Elijah Muhammad and Minister Malcolm X. And why this is important to me, right? A lot of what made Malcolm and the nation popular was his ability to critique Christianity, right? And for those who are familiar with Harlem during the 20s through the 1960s, what was very popular was what we call the soapbox preaching, right? So everybody would get their ladder or get their soapbox and they would set them up on various corners throughout Harlem, and they would give their speeches and they would give their sermons, right? And one of the things that made Malcolm so popular is he would set his ladder on Sundays in front of the Black church. And when they would come out of the Black church, he would use that as a process to recruit individuals into the Nation of Islam. And oftentimes what he would say, you spent all these hours praying to their God, but their God has offered you no liberation, right? And Islam is the true faith of the Black man, right? And so as this type of commentary picks up more and more steam throughout Harlem, Black Christians felt the need to offer a response to that, right? Because it's very easy for those who practice Islam to say, well, Christianity is the religion of your oppressor, and you're praying to the same God who they are praying to, who oppresses you. It's a very easy claim to be made, right? But history is important, because if you know the history of Africa, and if you're familiar with the works of Chancellor Williams and the book entitled The Destruction of Black Civilization, you know that before Christianity came into Africa and did its work to destroy Africa, Islam came in and did that same work. Before there was a transatlantic slave trade that took Africans to the Americas, right, through the western portion of Africa, the eastern portion of Africa was experiencing an enslavement trade as well that was produced by the Arabs and Islam, right? So one could argue just effectively as Christianity can be viewed as an oppressive religion. One can make the very same claim about Islam, okay? But again, Black liberation theology was the response that Black Christians produced to the critique by Black Muslims, okay? Okay, so we're going to transition into the history of Islam in America. So it reaches all the way back, it says, to the voyage first commissioned and then undertaken by Emperor Abu Bakr II. Okay, so he's saying we can trace Black Islam in the Americas all the way back to the 1400s and under the expedition of Abu Bakr II. Now I want to read something to you all. Actually, let me do this so you guys can see how this intellectual work is done. So on page 228, the very bottom of the page, we have the break in the page, and they say the Islamic tradition introduction, right? The opening paragraph states the history of Islam in America is a long one, reaching back to the Muslim voyage first commissioned and then undertaken by Emperor Abubakar II of Mali in the year 1311 through 1312, respectively, right? And then you have the parentheses, Muhammad, 2001, semicolon, Van Sertima, 1999. Do you all see that? So what that is, what the significance is, this information that has been articulated prior to that parentheses, he's letting you know that I got that information from this text by Muhammad in 2001, and also this text from Ivan Van Sertima in 1999. Okay, this is the significance of those parentheses. The text that he's referring to from Ivan Van Sertima is this book here. They came before Columbus. So you can see, this is Ivan Van Sertima, okay? I'm going to read to you from this book, and we're going to kind of complicate Karenga's claim. Okay. The Islamic influence on medieval Mali hardly touched the common people. Even the kings from Sundiata down to the king of the Atlantic expeditions, Abubakar II, so we know that name should sound familiar to you all, right? Abubakar II gave Islam little more than lip service. I'm gonna read that one more time. The Islamic influence on medieval Mali hardly touched the common people. Even the kings from Sundiata down to the king of the Atlantic expedition, Abubakar II gave Islam little more than lip service, okay? So what Van Sertima is arguing, right? Because to provide a little more context to what I've read, this chapter from this book is called The Mandingo Traitors in Medieval Mexico, right? And he's talking about how Africans from the west portion of Africa, predominantly from Mali, are coming to the Americas in the area that we now call Mexico, and they're making culture with the indigenous people who are already in that land, right? And he's saying that, and one of the reasons why he says that this is so is by looking at the language. And he said that there's several language confluences from words that the Africans would speak and the words that the indigenous people would speak. And he says a lot of these words that the Africans would speak, they have Arabic roots, right? And he's saying, I don't want you all to confuse the Arabic roots of these terms to think that Arabic and Islamic influence was pervasive all throughout West Africa, right? He's saying that's not the case. Really, the reason why they have these words with Arabic roots is because they were traders and they were travelers. The majority of the people who they traded and traveled with were Arab, right? So effectively, to be able to do this type of trade, you had to pick up the language. And they would take that language with them when they traveled to the Western Hemisphere and they traveled to the Americas. And some of those roots still have that Arabic root. Some of those words, still have that Arabic root, right? So let's do what we call a comparative analysis. We have what Karenga is saying in our book, right? And we have using the work of Van Sertima. So we're now referring to the work of Van Sertima, which is Karenga's source material. Y'all with me? So Karenga is making the claim that Islam came to the Americas as far back as Abubakar II. I'm not saying that he's wrong, right? But I would argue more so the culture that came to the Americas with Abubakar II was not Islam. It was more so a Malian culture or an African culture with hints of Islamic reference, right? Because they use those elements in their language. But they're telling you from the work of Van Sertima, which is the source of Karenga's text, that they only use those type of terminologies in the periphery. It's not the central to who they were as a people, right? So this is a way that you can use source materials to gain a deeper understanding of what's being claimed within these texts, right? And when you want to do good intellectual scholarly work, you could do one of two things: follow those parentheses, right? Or go to the end of the book, look through the bibliography, and start to kind of trace the line of thinking throughout those texts. So I just bring this up to kind of show you all how you could expand your scholarship beyond what's being presented to you, right? How you could read one thing and it provides you a little nugget that can lead you to a whole nother set of research, right? And this is what you should be doing eventually as scholars. For those of you who are looking to go into, get your bachelor's and move on to higher education, that's the type of intellectual and scholarly work that they will be looking for you to do. So I want to familiarize you all with that type of project early, okay? Okay, so let me go back to my notes. So another thing that Karenga makes mention, right? These individuals like Abu Bakr II, who came from Mali to the Americas, they come from this highly educated African society, right? Where literacy was highly valued and education was highly valued, right? So if you think back to the first week of our semester, and I showed you the college at Timbuktu, and I showed you the image of a brother sitting around all these books, and I told you that in Mali, textbooks were the currency, right? This is what Karenga is talking about when he's talking about a highly literate culture. Again, the first university in the world was centered in Mali, the University of Sangor, right? So these are the type of people that Karenga this is the type of society that these people who come from Africa to the Americas, this is where they come from, this is where they come out of, right? He goes into the 5 pillars of Islam, Shahada, which means bearing witness, Salah, which means your daily prayers 5 times a day, Sawam, fasting during Ramadan, Zakat, alms giving to the needy, and then your Hajj, your pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Mecca that you should make at least once in your lifetime if you have the means and the resources to do so. He moves into the teachings of Noble Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple of America. That kind of gives birth in 1913, excuse me. And then this is where he says, like, Islam really took its roots in Americas in 1913 with the Moorish Science Temple of America and Noble Drew Ali, and then really comes to the fore in the 1960s with the Nation of Islam. So the Moorish Science Temple of America started in New York, New Jersey. And this is a teaching that synthesized Garveyism, aspects of Christianity, Orthodox Islam, right? And various extractions for Oriental philosophy. So one thing is important is this idea of Garveyism, right? And I think we talked about this a little bit when we got into the civil rights movement, and I said you could really separate the line of thinking or bifurcate the line of Black thought into 2 types of thinkers, right? One of them being Garvey, and then one of them being the likes of like Booker T. Washington, right? So from Garvey, from his thinking tree, if you will, you have the Nation of Islam, you have Malcolm X, you have the Black Panther Party and things of this nature, right? So this very, what you would say, radical, nationalistic ideology comes from the likes of Marcus Garvey, okay? So Noble Drew Ali is taking these elements of Garveyism, right? He's taking how Islam is practiced back in areas like Mecca and what have you, Orthodox Islamic practices, right? And then little elements of Christianity, and he kind of merges them all into one to produce this idea of the Moorish Science Temple of America. Some of the main contentions of the Moorish Science Temple. What is key to African salvation is the recognition of their national Moorish origin, right? So you have to understand that you are a Moor. Islam is the only instrument for Black unity and advancement. 3, whites were opposite and negative to Blacks, never to be mixed with. 4, obey the law and refrain from radicalism. And I'm gonna pick back up on 4 as we get into the Nation of Islam. So remember 4, obey the law and refrain from radicalism, okay? And then 5, essential love, peace, and harmony in the world, especially among Black people, okay? So this is like the main tenets of the Moorish Science Temple of America. So the development of the Nation of Islam stems from a splintering of the Moorish Science Temple of America, right? So for those who continue to be Moors, would continue to follow the train of thought of Noble Drew Ali, right? The splinter group would come from W. Fard Muhammad, and those who splintered from the Moorish Science Temple would form the Nation of Islam. And as legend would have it, W.D. Fraud Muhammad would go missing for a number of years as he's doing his missionary work to build the Nation of Islam. This message would be passed down to Elijah Poole, who would become Elijah Muhammad, and he would be the leader and the figurehead of the Nation of Islam, okay? What I do want to do is read one of these, how the Nation of Islam talks about knowledge. I think this is very important. Okay. So this is on page 233, the second to last paragraph. He says, Muhammad understood knowledge as a divine attribute and an indispensable acquisition for self-understanding and appreciation of self, understanding and doing the will of God, and building a new world and new people. For him, Muhammad, it should be a liberating and uplifting knowledge, an education which enhances knowledge of self, which will enable the people to exercise the right of freedom, and which we may use towards the elevation and benefit of our people. It must be, he says, a comprehensive and depthful knowledge, including the history of the Black nation, the knowledge of the Black man in the universe, and all the sciences. In summary, he says, the education my people need is that knowledge, the attribute of God, which creates power to accomplish and make progress in good things or righteous things. Here he stresses the ethical purpose and use for knowledge, right? And so to me, when I look at this and I listen to this, it makes me think about the distinctions I draw between education and schooling, right? Again, schooling is designed to maintain society's power relations, right? Whereas education is designed to make you tap into your divinity. How Elijah Muhammad articulates what knowledge should do, to me, aligns directly with this process of education, right? I know I wasn't assigned, I didn't assign this part of the reading to you all dealing with Malcolm X, but I couldn't not read the Malcolm X portion. So I'm gonna just go into that a little bit. And for me, I'm just gonna kind of touch on some of the things that Karenga talks about that were of importance to Malcolm. A cultural revolution, right, is important to Malcolm. A cultural revolution that's designed to decolonize the African mind. He's also emphasizing a return to the source, and that source being Africa, right? And he says that it does not necessarily have to be a physical return where you're packing up your bags and you're moving to Africa, right? But it could be a return mentally, culturally, and spiritually, right? And I would even put on the table, it should be a return. And I think just like how in Islam, right, you make your Hajj back to the Holy Land of Mecca, I think for Africans residing in the Americas or abroad throughout the diaspora, they should also make that Hajj or that pilgrimage back to any portion of Africa just to kind of reconnect to the source. And this is just me throwing that out there, right? What I also found of importance was Malcolm's musings on the role of women. And I'm going to read that portion real briefly, and then we'll talk real quickly about how Black women in Islam caused the rupture. So it says, fourthly, Malcolm argued for, I'm on page 235, the second full paragraph that starts with fourthly. Fourthly, Malcolm argued for respect and equality for women. He moved from an early position of a simple concept of protective respect for women to a fuller and more ethical concept of respect and recognition of the equal worthiness and equal rights of women. It was in his attempts to define his own field of vision and ethical concern outside of the Nation of Islam that he began to modify his earlier view. Thus, in discussing his ideas as a result of an expanded exchange and interdependence with his wife, Betty, and his travels to Africa and the Middle East, he stated that in every country you go to, usually the degree of progress can never be separated from the women, right? Here he measures the progressiveness or backwardsness of a country by the position and knowledge or education of the women. In addition, he stated that he became thoroughly convinced of the importance of giving freedom to the women, giving her education, and giving her incentive to get out there and put that same spirit and understanding in her child. He concludes praising the contributions that our women have made in the struggle for freedom, and asserted that he is for giving them all the leeway possible because they made a greater contribution than many of us men, right? And to me, this is very profound for a few reasons. One, for me, Malcolm X, there's two things that guide Malcolm X. One is truth, right? If you know Malcolm's story, you know he goes from a hustler, a pimp, to a convict, right? He's convicted in Boston. He does his time in Boston, where he comes into the knowledge of the Nation of Islam with Brother Wilbur. That is a new truth that is Malcolm is presented, right? The Nation of Islam becomes a new type of truth for Malcolm. So he pivots from his lifestyle as a hustler, a pimp, and a convict to the truth of being a member of the Nation of Islam. And he practices this truth for many years and becomes the Malcolm X that we all know, right? But then he's confronted with another series of truths. And he finds out that Elijah Muhammad has had children out of wedlock, which is out of alignment with what he says that are in the sacred texts of the Quran and the Holy Scriptures that they follow, right? So now he has a contradiction with the truth that he was operating under by following the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, right? So now he has to make a decision. Do he move with the truth that he learned, or do he stick with what he's known and what makes him comfortable, right? And he chooses truth, which in fact makes him defect or split from the Nation of Islam. He gets put on a 90-day silence and eventually moved out of the Nation of Islam. But while he's on his 90-day silence, he makes his Hajj to Mecca, right? And he sees while on his Hajj that there's white folks, right? What he calls pale-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired white folks who are participating in this practice of Islam, right? Because he knows from how Nation of Islam talks about Islam and talks about Mecca, white folks can't make it into Mecca according to the teaching of Elijah Muhammad, right? But Malcolm with his eyes saw different. So he had to abide by that truth, right? While he's traveling through Mecca, he's meeting some of the high-ranking officials in Islamic, in the Islamic religion, and they're explaining to him Orthodox Islam, and they're explaining to him the contradictions that the Nation of Islam has against Orthodox Islam, right? So again, Malcolm is faced with another truth. And he realizes the way that Islam is being practiced by the Nation of Islam is not in alignment with Orthodox Islam. So when he returns home from Mecca, he establishes Muslim Mosque Incorporated, right? This is his religious organization to instill in Africans in the Americas an Orthodox relationship with Islam, not the distorted version of Islam that you gain through the Nation of Islam, right? He also establishes the organization of Afro-American Unity. This is going to be his political arm to do his organizing, right? So I mentioned the fourth component of the Moorish Science Temple, which is to obey the law and not to engage in any radicalism, okay? That principle was also translated into the Nation of Islam, okay? So one of the things that Malcolm was doing in the Nation of Islam was he was training the fruit of Islam. The fruit of Islam is the security force for the nation. So a couple years back when Beyonce had her halftime performance and she did like the Black Panther homage for her halftime performance, the police departments were infuriated and they decided they will no longer secure Beyonce's concerts, right? So what happened, the Nation of Islam stepped up and said that they would provide the security force for Beyonce's concert since the police will no longer do that. Those individuals are the fruit of Islam. The fruit of Islam were originally trained and put together by Malcolm, right? So Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad came to heads over the purpose of the fruit of Islam. So Malcolm's position was, why are you having me train our military faction, right? Our defense wing. And when there's things like the bombing of the church in Alabama, when there's things like our brothers from the Nation of Islam, Temple number 5, no, not Temple, Temple 13 in LA, when the police are running up into our temples and brutalizing our members, why aren't we sending the Fruit of Islam down there to defend our people, right? But Elijah Muhammad was still operating under that fourth principle of Moorish Science Temple, which says do nothing radical and obey the laws, right? And Malcolm got extremely impatient with that. He felt that the Nation of Islam wasn't using their resources to the utmost ability that as they should to defend their people, right? For those who are familiar with the Black Panther movie, it's kind of the position Killmonger has, right? So how are we here Wakanda with all these military resources and we're allowing other Black people throughout the world to suffer? It's kind of the same position Malcolm had. How are we here, the Nation of Islam, with all these trained soldiers, and when we need to defend ourselves, we're not utilizing these resources, right? So this is part of the separation that Malcolm had with the nation and caused him to lead the nation. But again, more so than that, it was the truth, right? What I thought was, I found out it's not. So now I have to make a decision. And what guided him on his decision-making was following this principle of the truth. Real quick, just not real quick, because I don't want to diminish, but I do want to touch on the role of Black women in Islam. And I mentioned the rupture, right? For my PhD, I'm doing cultural studies, right? And from a cultural studies discipline standpoint, you're trained to be attentive to the rupture, right? COVID has been a rupture in our society, right? After COVID, things will never be the same, right? The civil rights movement was a rupture in our society. So after civil rights movement, the society never operated the same. So you want to be able to be attentive to the rupture, place yourself in the rupture, and then start to do your intellectual work from there, right? This is the way that you're trained as a cultural studies practitioner. Black women in Islam caused a rupture, right? One of the ruptures that they caused in this religious discourse, is what they call it in the text, is the idea of intersectionality. Has anybody heard of the term intersectionality before? No? Okay, so intersectionality. If we are to use unique as an example, okay? Intersectionality is also embedded in this idea, of this notion of positionality, okay? So your positionality is what makes you you from a social standpoint. So again, if we are to use unique as an example, from what I see, right? From what I observe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would identify unique as a woman, right? And I would identify unique as a Black or an African woman, right? So that's her positionality. Her position in the world is a woman. Her position in the world is a Black woman, right? Your positionality could also include your religion. It could include your orientation. It could include, all those other things that make you you. Your intersection, though, is where your womanhood meets your Africanity, right? Or your Blackness. That is intersectionality. Laura Ann would be, she's a woman and she's a European descended woman. So that would be her intersectionality, right? So what Black Muslim women were able to do was to bring the conversation of intersectionality to the discourse, right? So prior to the Black woman's rupture in Islam, you were only talking about issues that Black men in Islam faced. But the women were like, hold on, man, we got shit that we dealing with too. Like, don't leave us out of the conversation, right? We want to talk about how we're also oppressed by, as not only Black folks, but we're also oppressed as women, right? So this is one of the ruptures that they caused. And then I think another one that they've caused that's very beautiful is they use the Quranic text to support their ability to be actional agents, right? And it says, based on the Quranic assumption that mandates justice and that unless women and men are experiencing and practicing justice, they are not practicing Islam, right? So in other words, you cannot oppress me as a woman and call yourself a Muslim, right? That is out of context with the Quran itself. It's out of context with Islamic practice, right? So all people deserve this element of justice as articulated by the Quran. And if you feel that I don't deserve my justice because I'm a woman, then you cannot call yourself a Muslim, right? And to me, this is a very beautiful rupture that Black women in Islam cause that relates it right back to the core and central text, the Quran. So I'll put a pause in my notes and we'll jump into our fishbowl. Remember, you have one time to pass. You must do 2 a semester. You could talk about my notes. You could talk about your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout room. Who would like to volunteer?
I'd like to volunteer.
Okay, Kevin, thank you. Anyone else? If not, I'll just call on people. All right. Brianna, are you prepared to fishbowl? Brianna Vasquez, are you prepared to fishbowl? So I'm going to use this as your pass for the semester, Brianna. So if you get called on again, you do have to participate.
I could participate in it.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we got Gabriel and Kevin. I'll call on one more. It says iPhone. It may be Karen, I may be wrong. But iPhone, are you prepared to participate in the fishbowl?
It's Brian.
Brian,
No,
okay.
Professor. I'm gonna skip on this one.
Okay, so you used your one skip for this semester. Okay, Brian, thank you though. Jessica, are you prepared to fishbowl?
I guess I have to because I already used my thing.
And it's really not that big of a deal. Anything that comes to mind, you can just discuss. So we'll go with Jessica, Gabriel, and Kevin. Who wants to start us off?
I guess I'll go first.
Okay.
So one thing I want to talk about was earlier how the distinction of Black Christianity, going back to that, one of the things that they talked about in the book was how distinction between the purpose of the church, like the building, how it's used, how typically it's always viewed as just like a place of respect and worship to God. But in Black Christianity, it's used as like, it's used as both a church and as like a town hall per se, as both in one. How they would get together and discuss about problems in the community that they need to work on. An example that I can use was how recently I watched a documentary. It was talking about the sharecroppers in the Boot Heel of Minnesota, of how Owen Whitfield, he would gather them all up together into the church, and he would discuss about how they should go about their problems and fixing their needs.
I'm gonna pick up on your comments, Kevin. I'm gonna discuss this notion of subversion. So I'm gonna let the fishbowl complete first. Who's next?
I'll go next. So and the first question for the critical thinking question to discuss the ancient Egyptian myths and conception of humans as possessors of dignity and divinity, and like how does it claim and justify claims of human rights and a respect for life and human person. The answer is the Egyptian myths and conception of humans as possessors of dignity and divinity is that we as humans are all built in the image of God, in which God being divine, we are the divine creation of God. So it is in our nature to have respect for each other. Karenga states that, quote, humans as images of God have a special moral, even sacred status, and must never be treated themselves or each other in any way that violated their inherent dignity, which is grounded in their identity as images of God. And this explains and justifies claims of human rights and our respect for life and human persons, because it is against God to harm his or her divine creation. As said by Jedi that, quote, it is not permitted to do such a thing to the noble flock of God, based on the ancient Ma'asin teaching, which stresses not to kill or do any kind of harm to others.
Thank you, Gabriel. Very comprehensive. Who's next?
So I talk either between the critical thinking questions or today's questions, right?
Yeah, whichever you feel is important.
So for number 3 of today's questions, I think what's really interesting is basically the dichotomy between like Muhammad's versus Malcolm X and how they separated, because they had difference in viewpoints, but overall have the same overall like goals set out, all because Muhammad, he violated what he had preached,
Mhm.
and which was enough for Malcolm to basically take leadership and try to like preach his own ideals and keep true to them.
Yeah, I agree. And then I think too, it's interesting, right? You see this transition from the Nation of Islam, from the Moorish Science Temple to the Nation of Islam, right? The split that takes place to build out the Nation of Islam. It replays itself out with Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, right? So those who stuck with Elijah Muhammad stayed within the Nation of Islam, but those who went with Malcolm would either evolve into the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or would go into the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. And then also what would happen, right, as this type of thinking gets more modern in the 80s, in the early 80s, and I forget the individual who started it, but you have another separation, right? And you would get what's called the 5% Nation, which is another sect of Black Muslims who kind of have their own ideology around this concept of Islam and how to actuate this notion of Islam. And what they were really about was, Islam is very strict. The Nation of Islam is very strict. You can't eat pork, you can't smoke cigarettes, there's a lot of things that you can't do. And with the 5% Nation said, that turns a lot of people in the streets off. Like they still want to be Muslim, but still want to, crack a 40 if they wanted to. They still might want to smoke some weed if they want to, right? So we're going to open up this avenue of the nation to allow those who may be turned off by the strictness of it, right? And still allow them to practice the faith of Islam, but not have the more rigid confines that the Nation of Islam produces. So Kevin's musing on the Black church, right? And he's spot on in his recognizing that the Black church served multiple hats, right? So yes, it served as a religious institution. Yes, it served as a building to house these religious rituals, right? But it also serves as a social gathering space. And for me, this notion of subversion becomes very important. Who knows or who has heard of the term subversion before? To be subversive.
I heard of it. It was familiar word, but I think when my parents were talking about subversion, they were talking about like the different kinds of like worlds, just like society.
Okay. So yeah, it's definitely to do with society, right? And I think also when you talk about subversion, you can't really understand subversion without understanding power, right? And really what subversion are acts that undermine power, right? You find a lot of subversion in the plantation society, right? So those who were enslaved would come up with very creative and efficient ways to either get themselves free, to get out of the work that they were supposed to be doing on the plantation, to undermine the authority of those who were had power over them, right? One of the more brilliant acts of subversion. So this is like a collection of Black newspapers that are compiled, right? And one of the stories that are told is of this individual who was formerly enslaved. And what he does is he gets this big ass box, right? A box that's big enough for him to fit inside of. and he mails himself up to Canada, right? So this is way to subvert this institution of enslavement by literally mailing himself to freedom, right? So this is ideas or these notions of subversion. Now, if we're talking about religion and religious subversion, you all articulated very well how one of the critiques of Christianity is that it was introduced in some iterations from the forces of enslavement, right? So what African people do to subvert this religious oppression is they're like, yeah, you know what, we'll practice your religion, right? But we need a space to practice your religion. So give us this little barn out here so we could, engage in your Christian practices. Most of the times on Sundays, the enslaved Africans were allowed to practice their religious services on their own, right? Very rarely would the overseers or the enslavers come to kind of check in on what they did during their religious practices. So they would use those times to organize, and plan revolts, right? So this is one way that they use the religion to be subversive, right? Another subversive act in Black religion that doesn't often get talked about, right? And I think it often does not get talked about because African people don't really know their indigenous spiritual practices, right? So for those who have been in a Black Baptist church, you might be familiar with this phenomenon, right? The music starts to pick up, right? And you start to see one of the elder sisters kind of catching the pace of the beat. And she just kind of loses controls of her faculties and what we may call the Holy Ghost, right? If you don't know no better, you would think that that sister's been possessed by a spirit, right? I mean, I've seen some get so caught up in the Holy Spirit that their wigs fall off, right? It ain't no big deal. They just pick the lady up, put the wig back on her, and keep it pushing, right? But this is how pervasive this Holy Spirit could be. And you would think if you don't know any better, there's something wrong with it, right? But if you watch ancient African spiritual traditions, ancient African rituals, you would see the same type of possession take place in the body of these people. You see the same type of movements, right? You see the same type of seemingly loss of consciousness. I bring this up as an example of African people sliding their ancient spiritual practices inside of religious institutions, right? Another way this is done, for those Africans who were brought to places like Brazil, who were brought to places like Cuba, right? They are more familiar with what you would call contemplé, right? Contemplé is like an African indigenous spiritual tradition, just like Ifa, just like Akan. Some may consider it like voodoo or voodoo, right? So what they do, because they were introduced to areas that were Catholic, right? Your Catholics have the saints, right? So Catholics have the saints. Ifa and these ancient African traditions have what are called Orishas, right? And these are like intermediaries that serve between the people and God. So what the Africans would do is assign an Orisha to a saint. So let's just say a shoe is one Orisha, right? So instead of calling him a shoe, we'll be subversive and call him Saint Paul. But when we do our prayers and we do our rituals, we know we're praying and we're honoring a shoe. But if the master were to hear us, all they hear us talking about is Saint Paul. So the master is none the wiser, right? But I'm still able to practice my African tradition and subvert my African tradition right under the eyes of the oppressor and then be none the wiser. Another subversive act. Has anybody heard of Capoeira, the martial art out of Brazil? No? So Capoeira is a martial, okay. Unique, can you kind of speak to, is your sound working? If it is, can you kind of speak to Capoeira and what that is and what it looks like? I think your sound is down. So what's dope about Capoeira, right? It's a martial art, but if you look at it, it looks like they're breakdancing, right? And it looks like it's just a dance, right? And what's dope about it is they made it look like a dance so the enslaver won't think that they're practicing martial arts, right? So this is a subversive act that Africans have practiced since the beginning of time, right? In the modern day, right? You, your homie, got some folks in the backyard driving the car, you know you have a warrant on you, right? You know you have a warrant on you. If you get pulled over, they run your name, you going to jail, right? You know that your brother, though, don't have a warrant. So y'all get pulled over, they asking for IDs. Officer, I don't have my ID. Well, what's your name? You give them your brother's name, right? Because your brother don't have a warrant. So you outsmarted the power authority to keep yourself safe. This is this idea of subversion. Jessica, were you gonna say something?
I was gonna say, is Capoeira similar to Capoeira? Because the Capoeira is when it also is a dancing one.
It's the same thing. I think I just maybe mispronounced it, or depending on where you're from, how it will be pronounced, but it's the same practice, yes.
I have seen it before. It was like mentioned in the show, and they were like showing it off, and that's how I know about it.
Yeah, but the important thing is, right, is like that is an example of how African people were able to slide in elements of self-defense without the oppressors even knowing what they were doing. I want to hear back from y'all. Let's get 2 comments, and then I'll ask Baba Pierre if we're good to go. So please give me 2 comments before we go to Baba Pierre.
Yes, I want to share my thesis,
Okay.
then my critical thinking question.
Okay.
My thesis first. Black American religious leaders, through their militant teachings, have raised awareness among African American to engage them in the struggle for desegregation, civil rights, and a religion that aligns their spiritual and existential needs. And this is my question. African American Muslim religious leaders have consistently asserted that Islam is the most suitable religion for Black people compared to Christianity. Can someone develop an argument to refute this claim?
Again, another profound question, Baba. And I think for me, right, it would go back to the work of Chancellor Williams, who argues that, you know, Islam is just as much of an oppressive religion as Christianity. In fact, he argues that all that really happened in Africa was the oppression and subjugation that Islam did was simply replaced by the work of Christianity and the Europeans, right? And if you, to take it a step further, when a lot of the Europeans first came into Africa and they observed the surroundings within the continent and the social milieu within the continent, they found that a lot of what they were called were undeveloped, or what they may call primitive, right? Chancellor Williams argues that it was only in this primitive, quote unquote, primitive state because they were fleeing from Arabic enslavement, right? And he makes this argument that African people at the time could build these really big and robust buildings and temples, right? And they've done it in the past, but it didn't make sense because as the Arabic slave trade came, they would have to pick up and go. So what they started building instead were like these little huts that were easily to be taken down and transported, right? And I just say all of this to say that to your point, Baba, like, can someone make an argument against the claim of Islam being the ideal religion for African people? I think Chancellor Williams already made that claim by stating that, you know, all that happened was Christianity replaced Islam as the oppressive force. For me, I like to go back to the spiritual institutions that predate Islam, that predate Christianity, things like Ifa, things like the Akan tradition, right? Those are, to me, are the ideal religious practices for African people, because this is what we were doing prior to European contact, right? Tapping into the Kemetic mystery systems and the Kemetic spiritual practices, concepts like Ma'at, you know, those are to me, how I structure my spiritual life and how I structure my household spiritual engagement and practices. Again, just going back to what we were doing prior to the contact. Is that sufficient for you, Baba?
Yes.
Yeah. How about you, with your insight from being on the continent? How does religion play out on African soil?
And in Africa, generally, Islam, the Muslim religion is look like the traditional religion, and the Christianity is look like the religion of the white man. That is because in the early time the priests and the bishops were all from France, from England, and Muslim religions, the imam were the brothers,
Yeah.
the man of the town of the country.
Yeah.
So many people took that Islam is a traditional religion.
Yeah. This is my last thing before we call it a day. For me, I always, as a Pan-Africanist, I look at, because Africa as a culture is so diverse and it's so heterogeneous, right? So for me, what I look to is the cultural similarities throughout the diaspora. And what Baba Pierre just articulates is exactly what's articulated by Karenga, right? And the phenomenon's the same. If you think about who's promoting Islam, right? You have the likes of Malcolm X, you have the likes of Elijah Muhammad. Some of the most radical Black figures are promoting this idea of Islam. So naturally, you will fall into the understanding that this has to be our natural religion, right? And you see a lot more white pastors that are promoting Christianity, where you rarely see white pastors promoting Islam, right? So you could easily fall into the understanding that the African religion is Islam, right? But again, history, as Malcolm X says, is best qualified. History is best qualified to reward our research. Baba Pierre, I'll be good to call it a day, sir.
Yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Thank you, Baba. Again, please, if y'all can, tomorrow at 6 p.m. Via Zoom, the Bolo Kaja 2 talking about hip hop and activism. And for sure, if you got to choose one, I suggest you all come to Thursdays at 4 p.m. Myself and Dr. Natalie Sartain, the chair of the Black and Africana Studies Department, will be in conversation around Black History Month. Other than that, y'all, be healthy, be wealthy, be wise, get your sunshine, get your water, get your exercise. Peace.